Our next speaker is Monsignor Stuart Swetland, and he's was until very recently Vice President for Catholic Identity at Mount St. Mary's University. But I think we can say that he's just been appointed President of Donnelly College in Kansas City, Kansas. So our congratulations to him. And he's also Executive Secretary for the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. Welcome, Monsignor.
The advantage of going third is you can say ditto to a lot of what you just heard. The disadvantage is you're trying to self-edit from what you were prepared to say because it will be somewhat repetitive. But I do want to say to both Megan and Mary, ditto. We all were stuck with the problem of defining libertarianism. I wanted to be fair and try to pick one that was an American definition that was situated somewhere in the middle of the spectrum of libertarianism. So I went to Libertarianism, a primer published in the 90s by the Free Press. The Cato Institute's David Boaz defined libertarianism as the view that each person has the right to live his life in any way he chooses so long as he respects the equal rights of others. Libertarians defend each person's right to life, liberty, and property rights that people have naturally before governments are created. In the libertarian view, all human relationships should be voluntary. The only actions that should be forbidden by law are those that involve the initiation of force against those who have not themselves used force, actions like murder, rape, robbery, kidnapping, and fraud. Charles Murray, of course, also in a book published in '97, the same year, What It Means to Be a Libertarian, reminds us that, he has a similar definition of libertarianism, but he reminded us that historically this was simply known as liberalism, in the 18th and 19th century. Libertarianism, I believe, as so defined, is incompatible with Catholic social teaching in numerous ways, and I want to focus on just a few, drawing not from the critique of Francis, but from a previous critique, mainly associated with what many call the Communio school. Perhaps the best practitioners of that school are two men you might have heard of, Karol Wojtyla and Joseph Ratzinger, who are better known by their pontifical names. First, libertarianism has, as we've heard, an inadequate view of the human person. It has a faulty or inadequate or truncated anthropology, theological and philosophical anthropology. When John Paul II, now St. John Paul II, who took, remember, Das Kapital into the conclave that made him Pope, I do wonder what the fellow cardinals thought of that, wrote his major social encyclicals, he emphasized that the main failure of communism or socialism was its inadequate anthropology, a faulty notion of the being and purpose of the human person. By denying free will, our creation in the image and likeness of God, our immortal nature, etc., communism radically suppressed that which was necessary to make a modern society and economy function. The virtue of enterprise, industriousness, the creative subjectivity of the human person, and so forth. For example, John Paul II wrote in Centesimus Annos that the fundamental error, I quote, the fundamental error of socialism is anthropological in nature. Socialism considers the individual person simply as an element, a molecule within the social organism, so that the good of the individual is completely subordinated to the functioning of the social economic mechanism. Socialism likewise maintains that the good of the individual can be realized without reference to his free choice, to the unique and exclusive responsibility which he exercises in the face of good or evil. End quote. But the church also teaches that libertarianism has an inadequate anthropology. Going all the way back to the beginning of the modern social teaching of the church with Leo XIII, we see frequent condemnations of what was then called liberalism, as Charles Murray recognizes. For example, just to choose a priest from my own diocese, the servant of God, Archbishop Fulton Sheen, he wrote a commentary on Leo XIII's work in the height of the Great Depression, and he wrote, quote, "The myth of collectivism as the philosophy of liberalism are both wrong, for neither considers man in his totality, ignoring either the personal aspect of his nature, communism or socialism, or his social aspect. They both distort liberty." In other words, the human person, as we've heard, created imago Dei, is both radically, with the dignity of his or her own, is to be respected, but also the social nature of the human person. So those personal and social elements should be respected. I'm skipping a lot here because it's already been said. But this is also applied to the social question by, for example, Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI, when he wrote, "We must be convinced that charity is the principle not only of micro-relationships with friends, family members, small groups, etc., but also of macro-relationships, social, economic, and political ones." My second point, not all human relations are voluntary. The state and the family are what we traditionally call natural communities. Megan already commented some on this. This is how the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church puts it, quote, "The natural social disposition of men and women also makes it evident that the origin of society is not found in a contract or an agreement, but in human nature itself. And from this arises the possibility of freely creating different arrangements of association. It must not be forgotten that the ideologies of the social contract are based on a false anthropology. The family and the state are natural to humans. It's part of who we are as beings created in image and likeness of the triune God. A corollary to the belief that the state is a natural community is that government, in theory, is not inherently evil, but a necessary good. Governments are necessary to ensure and protect the common good. Third point, libertarianism privatizes faith, but Catholic teaching emphasizes that faith must influence culture, what Mary was just referring to, that faith has a social dimension. Here's how John Paul II put it, and I think in a very powerful statement. A faith that does not become culture is a faith that is not fully accepted, not entirely thought out, not faithfully lived. Now, when American Catholics hear that, they immediately think that the church is asking for us to have a Christian state. I think that is a misreading of that statement. Let's just take two very common American examples of where faith became culture. The Civil Rights Movement. No one can disagree that the main actors in the Civil Rights Movement were deeply motivated by their faith, often a Christian faith. And they saw the injustice of the Jim Crow laws as part of a sin crying out, a social sin crying out to God for justice. And out of that deeply held religious belief, they began to influence the culture by pointing out the injustice, the incompatibility of the Jim Crow's laws with the founding proposition of America, but also the basic text of their religious beliefs. We can go back a little farther, or a little bit to the labor union movement. Was another example of where faith became culture, to be the leaven that, in fact, the scriptures call us to be. And not only did it become culture, they became laws. So a faith, libertarianism wants to privatize faith into a private relational. Catholics understand that our faith has to influence culture. If we don't influence the culture, then our faith is not fully accepted, it's not entirely thought out, it's not faithfully lived. Fourth point, libertarian does not recognize the legitimate role of the state in regulating and ordering economic activity. A modern market economy needs much regulation. It needs much public works. There needs to be tax laws and corporation laws, liability laws, contract enforcement, patent laws, fraud protection, and many libertarians recognize this. There also has to be schools, electricity, roads, defense, police, fire, can go on, and many libertarians would agree with this. But there's also, in a modern market economy, many, many externalities. Things that, by the very nature of the way things work, are not captured in the pricing of goods. I'm probably the oldest one here. I remember when we did not have strong Clean Water Acts and did not have strong pollution acts, and those externalities were not priced into the cost of buying a gallon of gasoline. I used to pump gas at my mom's and dad's general store for 24 cents a gallon. It wasn't taking into consideration the reality of what that, not only getting it out of the ground, producing it, but what it was doing to our air and and likewise what products we're doing to our water. Externalities have to be regulated and brought into the market pricing, and that needs a strong central government to do so. You can't do it, and you can't have one set of pollution laws for Tunkhannock, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, and another one for Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I was born. I was a environmental refugee. My parents moved from Pittsburgh because it was unhealthy to raise children in the late 50s and early 60s, the air and water. So I remember that quite patently. Here's how John Paul II put it in Se Testimonies. This does not mean, however, that the state has no competence in this domain, as was claimed by those who argued against any rules in the economic sphere. Rather, the state has a duty to sustain business activity by creating conditions which will ensure job opportunities, by stimulating those activities where they are lacking, or by supporting them in moments of crisis. That's John Paul II endorsing the stimulus bill. He also talked, that was a joke. He also talked about the need to regulate monopolies, and also even goes so far in that same paragraph to say sometimes the state has to, what he calls a substitute function. When part of the economy fails, the state has to step in and do that. That's all in the same section where he praises the business and market economy. Fifth point, property rights are not absolute. They are secondary rights. Everything has a social mortgage. This is the universal distribution of goods. This was clearly seen in the Second Vatican Council, as we already heard, and also seen in Catholic social teaching throughout its modern existence. I'll give one quotation from the Compendium for the Social Doctrine. The universal destination of goods entails obligations on how goods are to be used by their legitimate owners. They must serve the common good. So there's no absolute property rights, which libertarianism seems to exalt to a level of dogma. Every piece of property is held in stewardship by its owner so that it can be used to serve the common good. 6, markets do not measure that which is most important. The most important aspect of human work, for example, is the subjective dimension of human work. Proof of this is that I assign as a university professor homework. I've taught university for almost 20 years, and in 20 years of teaching undergraduates, only one paper that I have received from an undergraduate has been published. Every piece of work they've handed in has been worthless. It's all gone into the trash can. Now, is it important that they do homework? Yes. Why? Because it makes them more. You see, when we work, there's two dimensions. There's something we make, the object or the service we provide, and there's something that work does to the worker. Catholic social teaching emphasizes that the most important dimension of work is the subjective dimension of work. I'll give one example from my childhood. There was a group in the Scranton area called Allied Services that employed the mentally handicapped. There, they produced goods, but it always needs to be subsidized. They didn't make a profit. But it was better for the people involved to be involved in the community activity of work. It was better for them. It made them more. It made the community more. But from a sheer economic point of view, it actually was a drain on resources. But it wasn't, because the subjective dimension of work, not taking into the pricing mechanism of things, is the most important. Another example, we don't have time to go into detail, is the consistent teaching of the need for a family wage. One person earning a living, working full-time, should earn enough or have subsidized their earnings enough that he or she, can take care of their family. This is never taken into consideration in any libertarian economics that I've encountered. Last but not least, libertarians talk all the time of subsidiarity, and they're right to do so. Of course, they de-emphasize solidarity, as we've already heard, but they're right to do so. But seldom do I find libertarians who want to apply the principle of subsidiarity to banks and corporations and the other entities that make up our economy. One of the reasons government is as big as it is to regulate the ever-increasing and growing size of those corporations and other entities that the government, to fulfill the common good or serve the common good, must regulate, right? As a matter of fact, this is why the church in her social teaching, much to the chagrin of almost every American on either side of the aisle, isn't calling for less government. The church is calling for more government. The church is calling for an international government For the world economy, that will be able to help regulate the increasingly reality of international corporations. Let me quote just one quotation from Benedict XVI. This seems necessary in order to arrive at a political, juridical, and economic order which can increase and give direction to international corporations for the development of all peoples in solidarity. To manage the global economy, to revive economies hit by crisis, to avoid any deterioration of the present crisis and the greater imbalances that would result, to bring about integral and timely disarmament, food security and peace, to guarantee the protection of the environment, and to regulate migration. For all this, there is an urgent need for a true world government, a true world political authority, true world political authority, as St. John the 23rd had indicated. So in fact, because corporations are now international, because of the size of our banking industry and other things, we don't need less government, we actually need more. To conclude, I will say that I think the bishops in America in 1986, when they published their letter on the economy, got the principles right, because they said the measure of a just economic policy is what it does to people, what it does for people, and what it does for the least well-off. Those basic principles, economics as if people matter, seems to me to be a richer way of approaching our economic and social issues. Thank you.
Can I borrow this?
Yes.